Hi there, and welcome to the Alberta Update. A look at what's happening in your province. I am your host, Bruce McAllister. Coming up on the program today, we will speak with Environment and Protected Areas Minister Rebecca Schultz. We will have the Justice Minister and Solicitor General Mickey Amery pop by, and all of the news, all of the projects that your government is up to, we'll try to cover. But first, as we always do, we say good day to the Premier, who once again has had a very busy week. Good day, Premier. Thanks for popping by.
Hi, Bruce.
Hey, rumors of a federal election are swirling. We're hearing it could be any day now. Some of Canada's business leaders are awful concerned with Mark Carney, of course, who just became prime minister when he won the Liberal leadership, because they're saying his policies are just like Justin Trudeau's. Now, you had a chance to speak with Mr. Carney this week. What was your message to him on behalf of Albertans?
Well, I'll start by saying I found him pretty non-committal. I had 9 different items that I told him were interfering with oil and gas investment in our province, from the No More Pipelines bill to the tanker ban off the West Coast. We've got net zero power regs, net zero building codes, net zero vehicles, and emissions caps on oil and gas, and everything in between. The plastics ban. I mean, don't we all want to have single-use plastics back again? We're fighting that one out in court. And so I asked him, like, how are we supposed to believe that you're going to support this industry and our aspirations to double our oil and gas production unless you start repealing some of these offensive bills? And as I say, I got a bit of a non-committal response. What we really need to see is an election. We not only to solve some of these issues for Canadians, but also to have somebody at the table for the next 4 years who can negotiate a new Canada-U.S. free trade agreement and get us out of the tariff war that we're in. So I'll keep an open mind, but I can tell you I don't have a lot of enthusiasm or a high expectation that we're going to see very much difference. The same people at the table. We've had 10 years of being targeted by the federal government, and there would have to be some very swift action to demonstrate a change of direction. And frankly, I just haven't seen that yet.
Well, that leads me right in to the next question. Now, you certainly have the support of industry. Some of Canada's most respected business leaders came together this week in unison, Build Canada Now, I think they called themselves, asking the federal government to go ahead and announce some of these things, to come up with some ideas to move the country forward. So what about this then? Because Eastern and Central politicians are all saying the right thing now. We need to build pipelines. We need to get Alberta's product to Tidewater. But I don't see anybody doing anything about it. So is this the case of action speaking louder than words and buyer beware?
Well, I think part of it was taking Alberta for granted and taking the country for granted and taking for granted that we would always have tariff-free access to our U.S. trading partner. I think it's taken Canadians by surprise, and certainly some of the more leftist politicians by surprise, that in point of fact, that's not a guarantee. And then when we started looking at our trade relationships, I think every province realized we had far greater trade relationships with our southern neighbors than we do with each other because of barriers, because of restrictions. In the case of Alberta, because our neighboring provinces wouldn't let us build pipelines to be able to get our product to new markets. And so I think that's been a wake-up call, is that if we're going to act and support each other as a country, that means that it has to be all the time, not just when it's politically convenient to do so. So I think that there is a genuine interest in trying to get those economic corridors built, and not just for oil and gas pipelines, for transmission lines, for highways, for rail lines, for broadband, so that we can move every type of product across this country and find new markets. So I'm feeling like there is a genuine interest in doing that on the part of the business leaders, on the part of the provinces. I guess we have to see what kind of commitment we get from the federal government to move forward on that. They certainly haven't in the last 10 years.
Exactly. And like you said, Premier, at the start of this, an election would be the best thing for all of Canada at this point. Hey, I will be speaking with your Justice Minister, Mickey Amery, in a few minutes. We're going to be talking about the Critical Infrastructure Defense Amendment Act, which was introduced this week. Let's talk about this as well. Is this another case of making sure we keep the federal government in its lane?
Well, completely. Remember, there's 2 things that the federal government did. One is they announced that they were going to have an emissions cap on oil and gas, which we know because it's such aggressive targets would act as a production cap. That would be the only way that it would could be achievable, is to actually shut in production. At the same time, they made it illegal for companies to talk about their emission successes, calling it greenwashing. And so you can't even have an energy company that's allowed to talk about the significant success that they have had in using technology to reduce emissions. So when we looked at that, we said, fine, for us to be able to tell Alberta's story, we'll be the ones who own the emissions data. We'll be the ones who celebrate it and are able to put it online, because you can't, the federal government carved out an exclusion in the law so that provinces can actually talk about their emissions successes. But more importantly, we're simply not going to let the federal government stand in the way of our oil and gas production anymore. On the grounds, they're using a pretext that it's about emissions. We know it's not. We know it's about keeping it in the ground. And that's part of the reason why we're exercising our rights under Section 92 of the Constitution, to make sure that we have the full authority to develop our resources, and we're prepared to defend it.
Your government announced a big tax break in the provincial budget, and families seem incredibly thankful. That's perfect timing to give people a break. A lot of business leaders coming out in support of it as well. What I found curious this week, Premier, during budget estimates, when the opposition members have a chance to question ministers and yourself on the budget, some of the opposition members were even musing about needing more taxes, and provincially maybe a PST. That's counter to what you and your government believe, of course. Explain the difference and why you are so locked in on giving people tax breaks.
Well, one of the proposals that was, or mentions that happened as we were going through looking at the budget, is an NDP member said, well, why don't you have the same tax structure as British Columbia? Well, just go across the border and see what kind of tax structure British Columbia has. They had a carbon tax up until recently. They have a sales tax, and they have those are the kind of things that are generating more revenue for the province, but it's taking it out of the pockets of hardworking British Columbians. So what I have heard is the opposite. What I have heard is that Albertans want us to find a new source of revenue from investing our substantial Heritage Savings Trust Fund assets. That's what we're going to do. We're going to grow that to $250 billion so that it ultimately can generate a new source of revenue without having to raise taxes on Albertans. We've got the lowest corporate income tax rate in the country of 8%. It's resulted in new businesses starting, and they're paying more in corporate tax revenue than they were before. But importantly, we've now matched that 8% with the low 8% rate on personal income taxes, to put $750 back in the pocket of every tax-paying Albertan, so that they're able to spend it on the things that matter to them as we go through this tariff crisis. So we just have a bit of a different approach. We think that the best people to decide how their money should be spent is Albertans, and we have to make sure that we're taking as little as possible to deliver on the services that matter to people, and not a penny more.
What a novel concept. Premier, one more quick one. We're bouncing all around here today, but the RMA, the Rural Municipalities Association, held their conference in Edmonton this week. You spoke at it. Your ministers were there. They listened. They did roundtables. They took questions from many of the provincial municipal elected politicians. One of the things everybody was talking about was the province's job in cutting red tape and making approvals and timelines better. Is that something we could see on the municipal level? Can you speak to what Minister Nally has done?
Oh, sure. Our red tape reduction minister, Dale Nally, we've hit our 33% reduction target on red tape, saving $2.9 billion for businesses. But the next step he took was to go and look at how many permits we require to be able to have permission to go ahead and start on new job creating ventures. And we have 490 different permits at the provincial level. But just by shining the light on that, the waiting time to get those approved has already been reduced by 20%. His next step is to go through and see whether there's a way of us doing automatic yeses, which means as long as you meet certain criteria, the answer is yes, you can go ahead. You don't need to wait for permission. And also having an automatic yes, that if it's not been told yes or no in a reasonable period of time, then it's also going to be assumed to be yes. The next step is asking for the municipalities to join us in this, because we have 320 different municipalities. They all have different types of permits, all have different timeframes. And if they can match that kind of approach, I think it'll clear away a lot of the barriers that businesses have to invest in. It is going to be extraordinary, the kind of investment we'll be able to attract to Alberta. So we wanted to get started, and we are really encouraging the municipalities to follow our lead.
Premier, hopefully the next time we do this, we will be in an election campaign. We'll find out soon, and we'll talk to you again next week. Thanks as always.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce.
All right, there is our Premier, Danielle Smith, joining us to kick off the Alberta Update this week. Well, we have some education news again this week. The Minister of Education making yet another important announcement. This time it was in Edmonton. Minister Nicolaides announcing a huge investment to Alberta kids. The Alberta government funding 14 new school projects in the Edmonton metro area, adding 16,400 new and updated student spaces. In total, there are now 36 projects underway in and around Edmonton. Last fall, Alberta's government, you may recall, announced a generational investment of $8.6 billion to accelerate school construction and to build new classroom spaces to address the unprecedented growth that we are seeing in Alberta. Over the next 7 years, Alberta's government will fund more than 100 new and renovated schools in our fastest growing communities around the province, adding more than 200 student spaces across Alberta. Here is our Education Minister, Dimitrios Nicolaides.
I'm happy to announce that 14 more school projects are on the way now for Edmonton and communities. As you can tell, I'm sure, by some of the cheering, and that these schools are desperately needed. Edmonton is one of the fastest growing cities and communities in all of Canada, and the need for space is urgent. I'm confident that these new school investments will help address the challenges of growing enrollment, that will benefit students and communities for years and years to come.
Budget 2025, if passed, funds a total of 41 new school projects across the province. In total, there are now 132 active school projects across Alberta, all of which are being fast-tracked through the new and improved funding process designed and released by Alberta's government, you'll recall, in the fall of 2024. Justice Minister Mickey Amery dropped some new legislation this week. The Critical Infrastructure Defence Amendment Act aims to protect Alberta against federal government overreach and protect public safety. And joining us now to talk more about it is the Justice Minister and the province's Solicitor General, Mickey Amery. Good day, Minister.
Well, good day to you too. Thank you.
First question, give us a broad overview of the legislation and what you hope to accomplish.
Well, Bruce, thank you. Yesterday, I proposed amendments to the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, and these amendments are intended to protect essential infrastructure and support our workers under the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Act. If the legislation is passed, we intend to update the definition of essential infrastructure so that we can include facilities where oil and gas production and emissions data and records are held, as well as create what we've said before, which is a 2-kilometer deep buffer zone north of the Alberta-US border. This is about public safety. This is about protecting Albertans, and this is about protecting Alberta from federal overreach.
Okay, a couple of things I want to follow up on, Minister. First of all, can you explain the connection you just mentioned between the Sovereignty Act, that motion passed in December, and this legislation?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, the Sovereignty Act passed in the Legislative Assembly in December, and it called for a number of measures to stand up to Ottawa's overreach into proposed oil and gas emissions cap regulations. First of all, I want to make it absolutely clear. We know that these emissions cap regulations are unconstitutional. We have a new Prime Minister. I would encourage the Prime Minister to read and familiarize himself with the Constitution. But most importantly, I think we have to pay specific attention to Section 92A of the Constitution, which gives the provinces, not the federal government, the exclusive jurisdiction over non-renewable resource development. We've been saying this for years. Alberta owns its natural resources. We talked about the Sovereignty Act motion and the need to restrict access to oil and gas facilities to only those that are licensed by the province. That's exactly what this legislation does. And if the federal government seeks to continue to overreach and introduce oil and cap regulations which are unconstitutional, then this legislation would allow us to tell federal enforcement officers that they have no reason to conduct emissions cap inspections on our facilities.
That is crystal clear, that explanation. I've heard the Premier say the exact same thing many times. And you should know Environment Minister Rebecca Schultz is going to be joining us in a few minutes to talk a little bit more about some of this and how it impacts her ministry. Minister, what about the 2 kilometer border zone into the Act? Explain why that's imperative and why you're going that route.
Well, it's imperative because I think as Canada and US are in alignment when it comes to border security. Our government introduced a plan to secure the Alberta-US border to crack down on the illegal activity and keep illicit drugs out of our province. This is a shared initiative. One of these commitments to secure the border was the idea to create a 2-kilometer deep border zone. And we wanted to enact legislation that would designate it as essential infrastructure. The idea is this: if we include a 2-kilometer border zone within the definition of essential infrastructure, we will provide our peace officers with the tools that they need to protect the area from trespassers, from interference, or from people who are willfully damaging the area or facilities when they have no lawful right to be there. I'm proud of this initiative. I'm proud of all of the border measures that we're bringing forward. Our Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Service has been working relentlessly to develop this border security plan along with Alberta Justice. And with this 2-kilometer zone in place, it's just one of the things that we're doing to combat crime and prevent drugs from coming into our province.
Well, I was just going to say, Minister Mike Ellis would be happy to hear you saying the things that you are today. He's been on the show and talked about the same things many times and the importance around the border. Hey, it looks like we could have a federal election anytime. Who knows what will happen there? But in light of the fact that we'll have a new government, that we have tariffs in the United States and dealing with that government, does that make this legislation even more important?
Well, I think it does, and I'll tell you why. I don't think that there's been a better advocate for Alberta and Canada than Premier Danielle Smith. From the first day, Premier Danielle Smith has been working relentlessly to work with our neighbors to the south to develop policies and programs and initiatives to sell the idea of Alberta to our neighbors in the south. This ongoing tariff dispute has proven now more than ever that Canada must build, and it must build big, and it must build fast, and it needs to reach markets all across the world. Canadians and politicians from all across the country are calling for new pipelines to be built to the east, to the west, to the north, to secure our future and end our reliance on our southern partner. However, I will say this: if our new Prime Minister continues to introduce job-killing policies like the oil and gas cap regulations, and we'll continue to fight those, we'll continue to stand up for Alberta, and we'll continue to defend Alberta's sovereignty.
100%. Absolutely. Couldn't say it any better. Minister, thank you for this, for explaining the legislation, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
There is our Justice Minister, Mickey Amery, on the Alberta Update with us. Well, the Government of Canada, speaking of building, has approved the City of Calgary's revised business case for the Green Line LRT project, and that meets the provincial requirements of connecting to the red and blue lines downtown, the new event center, and as far south as Shepherd. So what does this mean? Well, this approval ensures that the matching federal funding commitment of $1.53 billion for this critical project, and that construction can finally begin after a decade of delay since 2015. The new Green Line alignment saves more than $1 billion in tunneling costs with elevated alignment throughout downtown, and enables the city to add 5 more stations, increase the length by 76%, and serve 60% more commuters. The City of Calgary is responsible for delivering this project. Tenders for construction will go out in spring of 2025 with the focus to utilize local construction companies. Well, never a dull moment in politics, south of the border or right here in Ottawa, that's for sure. And a lot of what's happening has a big impact on a lot of our ministries, including the minister that's joining us now, and that is Rebecca Schultz, the Minister of Environment and Protected Areas. Minister, thank you. Thank you for joining us as always.
Yeah, of course, my pleasure.
Listen, Canada has a new Prime Minister, for now, a new environment minister for now, and I guess your main nemesis, if I could say that, in Ottawa, who has been the environment, Stephen Guilbeault, who has been the Minister of Environment. He's been shuffled, but it's almost like a promotion, I think, Quebec lieutenant or whatever that new position is. What are your thoughts on the new cabinet, on the moving of Mr. Guilbeault, and what we're seeing out of Ottawa?
Yeah, I would say after the last number of years of problematic, tone deaf, and activist policies, this minister should have resigned. He should have done the right thing. He needed to be out of cabinet, period. And so, again, moving him out of environment, we predicted that he would be shuffled and kind of joked about him going to Heritage Canada. But it is kind of, just a reminder that it wasn't just one minister that brought forward this litany of problematic legislation and regulation, right? We're talking carbon tax, emissions cap, the plastics ban, Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines laws. It was an entire Liberal government that brought those problematic pieces forward. I mean, he was obviously and remains an activist, and he was one of the most problematic ministers we had, absolutely. But now what we see is, before we had Justin Trudeau, I would say a prime minister who just went along with this activist, radical environment minister. But now we have a prime minister in Mark Carney who shares those very strong activist beliefs. Everything he has written and said on climate and economic policy over the last 5 years, his ardent support for carbon taxes. He believes in everything that Minister Guilbeault did in his time in environment. And I think that is going to be telling. I think it's going to be very problematic for this government. And it keeps the Liberals where they're in a position where they're completely out of touch with the vast majority of Canadians, but also the reality of what's happening right now. When we see the need shifting to focus on economics, our industry, and supporting, of course, not only Canadian but global need for safe, affordable, reliable energy and energy security.
Well, listen, you covered a lot of ground there. In fact, I was going to ask you, one of the questions I was going to ask you was going to be about the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. You've addressed that, and you'll be probably not surprised at all to know that your comments were pretty much bang on with the premiers who we had on a few minutes ago. So let's go to this. The Parliamentary Budget Officer released a report on the federal government's proposed oil and gas cap, and it's damning. It validated much of what you have been saying, what Alberta has been saying, what industry has been saying for the last year. And as we watch the feds fight with the independent PBO afterward, you have to wonder, what is your reaction to that? The fact that they're not accepting that emissions cap remains, that de facto production cap.
Yeah, it's not surprising, but as you said, seeing what came out from the Parliamentary Budget Office really does support and vindicate the position of Alberta, of our Premier, of our government, of our industry, and really supports everything we've been saying over the last number of months. So what the data says is that this will absolutely cut production by up to 4.9%, just about 5%. And also there is potential for up to 54,000 jobs lost. That is so out of touch at a time where right now we need to be focusing on strengthening our major industries and creating more jobs for Canadians, not essentially setting our sights on one of our major industries and decimating jobs, not just in Alberta, but right across the country. And so we're vindicated, but this federal government at every turn has completely ignored all independent analysis, all feedback by provinces. And now we're seeing again their own Parliamentary Budget Officer confirming what we've said all along. And they just continue to ignore it. And so while you have some ministers out there saying, yes, we support, Canadian energy. Sure, if you supported Canadian energy, you would start repealing and walking back some of these problematic policies like the production cap.
Yes. Pierre Poilievre, on the other hand, the federal Conservative leader, said he would get rid of the industrial carbon tax. The industrial carbon price as they would call it. Mark Carney, however, says that price is required. It is required for trade, and removing this price would harm our trade relationships. What is your reaction to those comments, both by Pierre Poilievre and by Mark Carney?
Yeah, we welcome Pierre Poilievre's announcement. This should absolutely be returned to an area of provincial jurisdiction, because obviously managing the emissions of our major industry goes hand in hand with managing energy production in our province. I often say, look, Alberta industry was doing the right thing for the environment, focused on reducing emissions long before this Liberal government came into office. What the Liberal government has done through their imposition of this additional federal carbon pricing system, and essentially the backstop. So it forces provinces to increase the carbon price, that level set again by the federal government. And what we've heard from industry is that increasing carbon price, which is set to go up to $170 per ton, is absolutely going to make our industry uncompetitive. And so if our industry is uncompetitive, again, we're not able to continue to maintain the jobs and the economies of Alberta and Canada, but we're also then not able to maintain our position as a jurisdiction of choice when it comes to safe, affordable, reliable energy. This is absolutely a problem. So we've been out talking to industry. Our own tier regulation is up in 2026, but with all of the uncertainty happening when it comes to the threat of tariffs from the US and all of the uncertainty happening at the federal level, we've been out talking to industry to say, hey, what could we do better? What's working? What's not? Because we cannot continue to make our major industries uncompetitive and then also expect them to deliver on all of the technology and innovation that we hope we're going to continue to see. And so again, it's out of touch. It's activism driving policy, which is scary coming especially from somebody who wants to continue to be the prime minister of our country.
All right, one more quick one. Alberta has led the way in reducing emissions and environmental stewardship for years now while increasing production. I have heard you say that many times. Why do Eastern politicians not see that? It's almost insulting to industry and the great work that's being done.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I mean, methane is one great example where industry was working on reducing methane emissions, again, long before the federal government came along with their mandates and arbitrary limits and policies. It's the layering of all of these policies, their industrial carbon pricing, the oil and gas emissions cap, the clean electricity regulations, their methane regulations that really harm the competitiveness of our industry. On the other hand, and especially before this Liberal government came along, our approach in Alberta has always been to work with industry to say, okay, what do we need to do from a policy perspective? How can we incentivize? And that's essentially what the tier system had allowed us to do, was through the levy on heavy emitters, then re-incentivize emissions reduction in those industries. And we've got quite the story to tell when it comes to emissions reduction there. In methane, we surpassed our target of a 45% reduction 3 years ahead of schedule. We blew past that, and we were able to save industry $600 million. And if we had done it the way that the federal government wanted to do it, when we look at our per barrel emissions intensity, that's down in the oil sands by well over 20%, and that is expected to increase. Electricity emissions are down by 53%. We are leading the way. We're doing that by working with industry. And you know what? When it comes to global emissions, given our great work, the answer to reducing global emissions, and I'm not just saying this, I've heard it around the world. I know our premier has heard it around the world. I certainly heard it when I was in Japan just a couple of months ago. Because of all the great work we've done on the environmental side, we are a jurisdiction of choice. Countries from around the world see us not only as their answer to safe, affordable, reliable energy, but also to emissions reduction and doing the right thing for the environment around the world by displacing less responsibly produced energy.
Continue your terrific work for sure, Minister. Thank you as always. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Bruce.
There is Rebecca Schultz, the Minister of Environment and Protected Areas here in Alberta. Well, as the province grows, so too does the strain on our municipal infrastructure. That includes our recreation centers, our roads, and other public spaces. To help municipalities deal with these concerns, Budget 2025, if passed, increases capital funding through the local government fiscal framework by more than 13%. And this increase will provide municipalities with a predictable and reliable source of funding to help build, maintain, and modernize the public infrastructure that their residents depend on. Well, that does it for this week's Alberta Update, a first-hand look at what's going on in your province as we bring you interviews with the Premier and ministers. And we will continue to do this every week that the legislature is sitting. A reminder, you can find us on YouTube, on Rumble, and all of the socials as well. Thank you for being with us this week, and we will see you again next week. Good day.